Bobby Fischer in the 1960s and early 70s was a chess phenomenon unlike any the world had ever witnessed. So ruthlessly accurate was his play, and so intimidating was his presence at the board that even strong grandmasters would often feel completely overwhelmed with what came to be called Fischer fear, a sense of panic and self-doubt that seemed to undermine their ability to even think clearly. At times, this psychological distress became so severe that it even seemed to manifest itself physically. People began to refer to this as Fischer fever, and it seemed to be a real effect. During Bobby Fischer's legendary 20-game winning streak of 1971 against some of the world's most elite players, 3 consecutive opponents of his, grandmasters Mark Taimanov, Bent Larsen, and Tigran Petrosian, all had to take time off mid-match in order to receive medical attention. Larsen and Taimanov complained of high blood pressure. I'm not really sure what was wrong with Petrosian. So an awful lot of Fischer's opponents were falling ill during this time period. Was any or all of it actually caused by the psychologically exhausting task of trying in vain to survive against Fischer's ruthless onslaught? There's no way to be sure, but what we can do is take a look at one of his most savage victories from this time period for some insight into the over-the-board brutality with which Fischer so demoralized his opponents. This game is from his 6-game candidates match against Bent Larsen, who famously lost every single game. We're going to be taking a look at game number 1, in which Bent Larsen puts up a very respectable fight. Apparently, he's not yet too psychologically or physically affected to give Fischer a run for his money. But this game is as good as it's going to get for Larsen. It's all downhill from here, and if his postponement of the match a few games later was indeed due to Fischer fever, as was speculated, then the demoralizing effect of losing this game surely played a significant role. So let's get into it. This game is amazing. You're going to love it. Bobby Fischer has the white pieces, and very unsurprisingly, he opens the game with e4. Bent Larsen replies e6, the French defense. We have the standard d4, d5, knight to c3, and now bishop to b4, known as the winnower variation, attacking and pinning the knight on c3, undermining the defense of the pawn on e4, which Fischer now pushes to e5. We have knight to e7, a3, questioning the bishop on b4, to which black only has one good reply, which is not bishop to a5, as that would allow white more queenside expansion for free with the move b4, again attacking the bishop. So bishop takes c3 check, now played by Larsen, is really the only way to justify moving the bishop to b4 in the first place, since after b takes c3, white now has the damaged queenside pawn structure, which black will try to prove is ample compensation for having given up his bishop pair. Play continues c5, very standard, striking at the center, and as close to the base of white's pawn chain as is currently possible, which is typically what you want to do. White has several good options here. Most popular among humans is queen to g4, going after the pawn on g7, which can lead to some sharp tactical complications. Most popular among stockfish, schooling at a depth of 79, is the move h4, which is not surprising. I mean, if you want to play like an engine, then my advice, which I don't necessarily advise that you take, is to just make a handful of sort of normal developing moves in the opening, don't castle, and then start pushing your h-pawn. Computers just can't seem to get enough of that. But the move Fischer plays is a4. Known to be a bit more positional, this move prepares a possible bishop to a3, targeting black's dark squares, which have been weakened due to the trading off of his dark squared bishop. This also prevents the old queen to a5, queen to a4 maneuver by black, targeting white's weak and currently immobile pawn on c2, which can sometimes be annoying. Play continues knight b to c6, knight to f3, at which point Larsen fails to play the move that is generally considered most preferable today, queen to a5, hitting the pawn on c3, pinning it to the king. If white plays bishop to d2, then there's no more bishop to a3 to target those weak dark squares. If queen to d2 instead, then black can play b6 followed by bishop to a6, looking to trade off his bad bishop, which is typically a problem piece for him in this opening, with its favorite diagonals currently blocked by the pawns on e6 and d5. Bent Larsen, in the game, instead opts for the much more passive bishop to d7, which at the time was more popular than it is today, but even then it was already starting to lose ground to queen to a5. Next, we have bishop to d3 from Fischer, preventing Larsen from immediately castling, as this would fail to a classic Greek gift sacrifice with bishop takes h7 check, followed by knight to g5 and queen to h5. Not going to get into all the dirty deets of that, but if you're not familiar with the Greek gift sacrifice, then all you need to know is that it can be quite nasty, and it's a gift that keeps on giving, and not in a good way. This move, bishop to d3, invites black to play c4, driving white's bishop back, though placing yet another pawn on the same color complex as black's bishop, which in and of itself is not a very good thing. However, there would be a slight upside in that white's c3 pawn would be immobilized and could then be targeted with queen to a5, which at this point is the move recommended by the engine. But Bent Larsen has concocted an entirely different plan, a dubious plan beginning with queen to c7. He's decided to go after the pawn on e5. After Fischer castles, we do have c4 attacking the bishop, which goes to e2. White's central pawn structure has been immobilized, and it now comes under attack with f6, which superficially looks kind of nice for black. The e5 pawn is attacked 3 times. White's never going to want to trade pawns on f6, since this would open up the g-file towards his king side. Not a good idea. But white is still firmly in the driver's seat after Fischer's very strong reply, rook to e1, adding some defense to the e5 pawn through the bishop on e2. If black were to try to win that pawn now with f takes e5, d takes e5, and knight takes e5, he would soon come to regret it after knight takes e5, queen takes e5, and bishop to h5 check, defended by the queen, winning the black queen. Bent Larsen, of course, does not fall for this in the game, but he doesn't play his best move either, which just might be to castle queenside, or kingside. I'm not even sure which one is better. Of course, that would allow bishop to a3, looking to come into the beautiful d6 square, when black still can't win the pawn on e5 due to his loose knight on e7, among other reasons. So Larsen decides that it's now or never. If he's going to win that pawn, it's got to be before the bishop gets into d6 to defend, and so the way he's decided to do it is with the move knight to g6. Which accomplishes nothing and is therefore a mistake, since after Fischer's reply, bishop to a3, preventing black from castling kingside as a result of his move knight to g6, it's still not a good idea for black to try to win the pawn on e5. His best chance now is probably to just castle and allow white to come into d6 with his bishop. Larsen has come this far though, and he's decided he's going to grab him some material with the highly blunderous f takes e5, d takes e5, and knight c takes e5, after which black is unequivocally losing. Fischer continues with the strongest move, knight takes e5, and after knight takes e5, we have queen to d4, an excellent square for the queen, preventing black from castling queenside, assuming he wants to hang on to his a7 pawn. The queen is also lined up with the undefended pawn on g7. Bishop to h5 check could be very good for white here with the discovered attack on the e5 knight. So Larsen, possibly already aware that he's in damage control mode, decides to play knight to g6, offering Fischer the pawn on g7. But do you think Fischer accepts? Heck no. He'd still be the better side if he did, but that would allow Larsen to castle. And Fischer's rather enjoying having black's king stuck in the center. So he plays bishop to h5, which is again the strongest move, opening the eyes of the e1 rook, and so threatening queen takes d5 since the pawn on e6 is pinned to the king. Larsen responds by playing king to f7, unpinning his pawn on e6, apparently hoping to castle manually by moving his rook and then playing king to g8, but Fischer just keeps the top engine moves coming with f4, and after rook h to e8, we have f5, attacking the knight, which is pinned to the king, forcing Larsen to play e takes f5, removing protection from his d-pawn, which now falls to queen takes d5 check. Now, if black could safely play bishop to e6 here, then he'd be doing just fine. Unfortunately, this fails to rook takes e6, queen takes f5 check, threatening to pick up the rook if the king moves, and if rook to f6, we have queen back to d5 with check. Black's only got 2 legal moves. If king to e8, then rook to e1 check will be mate in 5. And if rook to e6, then there's rook to f1 check, forcing the king to g8. The rook can't block because it's pinned and will be lost on the next move. Larsen can see that this is no rapid ride to deliverance, and so in the game, he does not block with the bishop, nor does he block with the rook, which would fail in the same way to queen takes f5 check, but instead plays king to f6. At which point, white is totally winning, but proving it over the board is not so simple. The position has become so complex that even the great Bobby Fischer is unable to find white's most crushing move. Pause the video if you'd like to take a crack at it. White's best move, not played in the game, is bishop to d6, attacking black's queen, and more importantly, keeping the knight out of e5. And so after, let's say, queen to d8, you got bishop to f3, threatening queen to d4 check, driving the black king either to g5, where he'll get mated shortly, or to f7, where he runs into big trouble after bishop to d5 check. Now, black has way too many defensive tries here for us to try to be comprehensive about, but I'll show you one of the most important, which is bishop to c6, when play should continue queen to d4 check, king to f7, queen takes c4 check, king back to f6, queen to d4 check, king back to f7, and now bishop to d5 check, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5 check, king to f6, and rook to f1, now targeting the f5 pawn. Queen to d7 adds defense, but now comes rook a to b1, threatening both rook takes b7 and rook to b5, hitting f5 with a third piece. White also has g4 to add a fourth attacker, so white's attack is just going to keep raging. The black king will never find a safe haven, and if white continues to play perfectly, he will most definitely win this game. Bobby Fischer, being a mere mortal, albeit the strongest one on the planet, in this position does not find the correct move bishop to d6, and instead decides to begin with the move bishop to f3, with that idea of playing queen to d4 check, and if king to f7, he can get his bishop involved with bishop to d5 check, which would all be good and well, and winning, if not for a startling defense that Larsen now finds with the move knight to e5, threatening to take the bishop on f3 with check. Now, this wouldn't have been possible if Fischer had first played the move bishop to d6, covering e5 with the third piece. Fischer, of course, didn't miss this move knight to e5, but he undoubtedly thought that after his response queen to d4, pinning the knight to the king, he would still be winning, threatening bishop to d6 on his next move. But here, Larsen finds the only move to totally equalize the position. Pause the video if you'd like to try to determine what that move is. Larsen's game-saving move is king to g6, unpinning his knight and so ready to meet bishop to d6 with knight takes f3 check. Of course, there is rook takes e5, now played by Fischer, when the recapture by black's rook would lose to bishop to d6, which is why Larsen must now recapture with his queen, allowing Fischer to take his bishop on d7. This brings us to a fascinating moment where we get to see the difference between the great Bobby Fischer and your standard world-class grandmaster. Fischer now has the bishop pair for the rook, which in a position like this would usually be winning, if not for some dangerous activity that Larsen is now able to generate, beginning with rook a to d8. And after queen takes b7, he's got queen to e3 check. If king to h1, then queen to e1 check will force mate on the next move. But after king to f1 and rook to d2, black is threatening checkmate in 1 on f2. This looks like an unsolvable problem for white. Apparently, Larsen assumed that this variation, beginning with Fischer's decision to capture the bishop on d7, would be winning for black. But Fischer, being Fischer, has seen much more deeply into this position than your standard GM, and has foreseen that he does have a defense. In fact, it's his only defense, queen to c6 check. And after black's only good response, rook to e6, now played by Larsen, attacking the queen, Fischer has... Pause the video if you want to try to spot white's only move that doesn't lose here. Fischer plays bishop to c5, counterattacking black's queen, while covering the f2 square through the black queen, thus preventing queen to f2 checkmate. However, Larsen does have a very frightening check at his disposal that has not been prevented, and that is rook to f2 check. The white king can only go to g1, but now comes rook takes g2, double discovered check. Now, it's worth noting that rook takes f3 discovered check would have been winning for black if white had played queen to c5 instead of bishop to c5, in case anyone was wondering about that move. Here, of course, rook takes f3 check could be met with bishop takes queen when white would come out ahead in material. But because this move played in the game, rook takes g2, is a double check, bishop takes queen is not possible, and the white king must move. Now king to h1 would be winning for white if not for rook takes h2 check, king takes h2, and queen to e5 check. And once the king moves, there's rook takes queen, bishop takes rook, and queen takes bishop, leaving black with an overwhelming material advantage. Fischer, in the game, after rook takes g2 check, instead plays the correct king takes g2, leaving black hideously down in material, but only for a moment, since Larsson now has queen to d2 check, and after king to h1, there's rook takes queen on c6, bishop takes c6, and queen takes c3. After which, we not only have momentary material equality, with black's extra pawns balancing out white's surplus in pieces, but according to the engine, it's also a dead equal position, despite the fact that Fischer can now grab a pawn with rook to g1 check, king to f6, and bishop takes a7, giving him a passed pawn on a4, which is quite scary looking. And it's the reason that for many years this position was actually considered to be already lost for black. But it's actually not. Modern day engines have demonstrated that black can actually hold the draw if he moves his king towards the center now to e6 or e5, when with the help of the queen, white's passed pawn can be kept under control. The proof of which is much too involved for our purposes here, but I will tell you that the saving of black's game does seem to hang on a single tempo, since after Larsson's move g5, the engine is saying that black is again losing, after Fischer's bishop to b6, defending the a5 square, preparing to push his pawn there next. We have queen takes c2, giving black a passed c-pawn, which is only 3 steps from promotion, but it's not going to save him. We have a5, queen to b2, preventing the pawn from being pushed to a6 for the moment, since that would lose the bishop on b6. Fischer moves it to d8 with check, the king goes to e6, a6 is played, we have queen to a3, attacking the pawn, bishop to b7, defending, queen to c7, guarding against the move a7, and now rook to b1, preparing bishop to b6, followed by a7 and the promotion of the pawn, which black is powerless to stop, without sacrificing his queen that is. What's tried is c3, but after bishop to b6, Bent Larsson has seen quite enough, and in this position, he resigns the game. If black were to play c2, then rook to e1 check, followed by the capture of black's queen, is the simplest. If the queen moves, let's say to e7, threatening to take the bishop on b7, if the pawn is pushed to a7, then rook to e1 check again wins the queen. If the queen moves somewhere else, let's say to c4, then we have a7, and after c2, there's rook to e1 check, and after the king moves, white's pawn promotes, and that's all she wrote, with the engine giving checkmate in another 13 moves from here, beginning with the promotion of black's pawn, to which white can respond bishop to d4 check. And if queen takes bishop, then the rook wins the new queen on c1. So what a game, and what a bummer for Bent Larsson. He gets outplayed by Fischer in the opening, finds an ingenious way to equalize the game, only to make a far from obvious blunder, which Fischer then punishes with his hopelessly perfect machine-like precision. That would be enough to make me feel sick, but give me all your thoughts about this one in the comments, and let me know if you've ever felt physically ill as the result of losing a game of chess. Don't forget to smash that like button if you liked the video and want to show your support, and consider subscribing to the channel to see more content like this on a regular basis. See you next time.